Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. I should address those of you first that were here on Monday. There could be some repetition in this, but I've got a different example, so hopefully keeps it relevant and fresh. So as Andrew mentioned, I'm going to present a method on deriving breeding goals using preference approaches, and we've used this tool for sheep, dairy cattle and plant breeding. And I'd just like to acknowledge my co-authors at this stage. So all around the world in livestock industries, scientists design breeding goals, and these don't always align with what farmers want. So a key question that we had when we started out using this tool was, how can we better design breeding goals that bring together the opinions of scientists and farmers? And we can design better breeding goals by using a software called 1,000 Minds. Now, 1,000 Minds was developed for the healthcare system and primarily to help surgeons rank people for heart surgery in a fair way. Heart surgery is pretty important, so obviously the tool had to be pretty useful. It's objective and transparent, and it was very successful in heart surgery and a bunch of other applications in the health system, and for that reason it's been used in a wide range of fields. So we've used it in animal breeding to rank the importance of traits in wool sheep in Australia, dairy cattle in New Zealand, which I spoke about on Monday, and meat sheep in Ireland as part of a project with Sheep Island and ICBF, and also pasture plants in Australia. And I'm going to use wool sheep as an example of its application in this presentation. So for the Australian fine wool industry, what we wanted to do was similar to what I spoke about on Monday, and that is to rank the importance of traits, to assess whether breeding objectives align with what is currently in use in the industry, and also determine whether there were differences in the ranking of traits across different parts of the industry in terms of the type of wool they produce. And ultimately we wanted to better understand the opinions of farmers and, as I mentioned at the start, design better breeding goals which bring together the opinions of scientists and farmers. So all of this was conducted online. We surveyed breeders and farmers of fine wool sheep, and we asked them some general information about their direction. The direction was in three categories defined as whether they produced fine wool and retained wethers, whether they were dual-purpose breeders and therefore used terminal size for a part of their flock, or whether they produced wool and sold their wethers either alive or to slaughter. We also asked them, amongst other things, whether they were a registered breeder, a commercial breeder, or a ram buyer. And in addition to that demographic type information, we carried out the 1,000 Minds survey. So this is an example of a trade-off decision that 1,000 Minds presents, and this is obviously for wool sheep. So you can see that it's a trade-off, and in this case the respondent's asked to decide whether he or she would like an increase in clean fleece weight or an increase in hogget weight. And the fantastic thing about this is that it's just a simple trade-off decision. Us as humans are very good at making those trade-offs. We make them every day, whether we would want tea or coffee, beer or wine, whether we would want stew or fish casserole. And you can imagine in a heart surgery example, the surgeon might be trading off between quality of life or the age of the patient or their level of pain. So the survey was sent out to about 4,500 breeders and farmers, and perhaps a small number, you would call it, responded to that at 350, but it's reasonably difficult to get people to do surveys. The largest respondents in that group of 350 were over 50, and they were registered breeders, and they were merino wool producers selling surplus animals. So their category was registered breeders primarily, and the majority of them had a direction. They considered themselves merino wool producers and selling their animals as surplus. In terms of the breakdown of the wool style percentages from that survey, 17% considered themselves medium wool producers, 37 fine wool, 27 fine, down to smaller proportions of producers producing super fine and ultra fine wool. And that's a pretty good representation of the Australian fine wool industry. But this is the ranking of the traits by the farmers in that survey group. So you can see we've got weaning percentage at the top, down to adult weight, and I should say that there were other traits in addition to this, but in order to keep the table understandable, I've cut them down to 7. When we compare the rank that the farmers gave to an index that exists in the Australian fine wool industries, it's called the 7% index, you can see that the ranking is not too dissimilar, but a couple of things come to mind, and that is that there is a higher ranking given to worm egg count and fibre diameter by farmers when compared to what is currently in practice. And so on the back of this type of information, we can ask ourselves the question, what is the correct rank? And steps beyond this process are to actually address that and possibly recalculate economic values and breeding objectives. So as I mentioned, there was a lower preference for improvements in fibre diameter and a higher preference for improvements in worm egg count. And there was also there's an argument for the benefit of customised indexes for specific wool breeders. So when we separated the results by direction, so this is whether farmers considered themselves to be fine wool breeders retaining wethers for wool production, whether they considered themselves dual purpose breeders or wool producers that sold excess animals, we found that fleece weight was most important for fine wool breeders and the least important for dual purpose breeders, and we found that strength was most important for fine wool breeders and least important for dual purpose breeders. In terms of category, separation of results by category, we found that hogget weight was most important for commercial breeders and least important for ram buyers. Breech wrinkle was most important for ram buyers and least important for registered breeders. And wool length was most important for registered breeders and least important for ram buyers. Just an overall perspective of how I see this 1,000 Minds tool fitting into the classic breeding program design. On the bottom right there, just to start you off where I'm talking about, I see it as a great tool for assessing the relevance of selection criteria and breeding program design, and also to assess whether current breeding objectives in industry align with what the industry expects. And if those things don't align, then there's potentially a mandate to actually make some decisions about changing that. Some key points in the use of 1,000 Minds, and these things that we've found most useful about it, is that it's objective and fair. It has been fantastic in getting farmer input into the importance of traits, and beyond that, just engaging farmers and getting them to discuss things and find out why they think things are different. It's been very informative across, the dairy cow study I spoke about on Monday, the meat sheep study here in Ireland, and finding out what the differences in preference are between different industry sectors and why that might be. And ultimately, it's useful in developing breeding goals that align or help us understand why there are differences between scientists and farmers. Mr. Chairman.